Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. Trust is the cornerstone to a healthy relationship, whether with family, friends, or voices in the media that would like your attention. Ideally, it is earned and appreciated, not demanded without evidence. But this is not an ideal world. The give and take of trust, expectation, and authority is ever shifting in society at large, and for the monolith of capital S science, too. So, how can trust in science communication be saved? And does it need saving anyway? Today we hear from Nicholas Dirks of the New York Academy of Sciences. In our far-reaching interview, we talk about science and scientists in modern society, being an expert in the public eye, and how the Academy aims to get ahead of whatever crisis may come next for the institutions of research and the whole of humanity. And joining me from New York, Professor Nicholas Dirks. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your time and joining with us today. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your professional academic background, and some of what brings us here today?
So I have been for almost all of my life an academic. I am a historian by training, but an anthropologist by inclination, I guess. I've taught at a number of great institutions in the United States, including Caltech, the University of Michigan, Columbia, and Berkeley. And I spent much of my life studying historical and anthropological questions in South Asia and South India in particular. Somewhere along the way, in the midst of teaching and writing books and spending time in India to do additional research and also coming to London, I took on administrative jobs of one sort or another in the university. I became the chair of the anthropology department at Columbia, a storied department in the US, which was the first department of anthropology in the US. I then, after doing that job for about 7 years, became the vice president and dean of the faculty of the arts and sciences at Columbia. And for close to a decade, worked really as a dean to work on hiring faculty, growing different departments, trying to improve the nature of the academic experience, both for students and faculty at Columbia. And just at about the point I thought of stepping back into the teaching and research world that I'd really left behind because being a dean is a very intense life, I was invited to move to Berkeley to be the 10th chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. So I went there, did that role for close to 5 years. In the course of both being a dean and being a chancellor, I saw a great deal of the university, far more than I had seen in my own disciplinary silos and furrows. I interacted a great deal with not just other humanists and social scientists, but also with scientists, and at Berkeley with engineers. At Berkeley, for example, I worked very closely with a group of faculty in neuroscience, and then went on from that to work very closely on a major initiative in data science, which has led to a new division at Berkeley and the fastest rising new set of courses for undergraduates, given the great interest, of course, in both data analytics and artificial intelligence. That's not surprising. But in the course of all of that, came to increasingly feel that the kind of interdisciplinary work that I had done in my own disciplinary areas needed to be expanded to the entire university. And so I became interested in the relationship between the science fields and the arts, which is to say the humanities and humanistic social sciences in particular. And when I was invited then to be the next president of the New York Academy of Sciences, I kind of leapt at the opportunity because it was an opportunity indeed to think about how to make science more relevant, more social, more embedded in the social, cultural, economic, and political world that it plays such an important role in. And also, of course, allowed me to interact with some of the great scientists in the US and around the world.
Could you tell us some of the horizons that you are working on, that you are looking towards, and some of the projects that people might either recognize or want to know more about?
Absolutely. A small historical detour to commence, which is to say that the New York Academy was founded in 1817. So it's one of the US's oldest scientific academies and associations. But it has gone through many different kinds of manifestations and phases over the course of its 200 and now 6-year-old history. It was a kind of convening space in much of the 19th and early 20th centuries for discussions about scientific discoveries. It's where some of the first major deliberations about Darwin's work on evolution was discussed in the United States. And more recently, in the 20th century, it was a place that often had the first discussions about new drugs, especially new antibiotics, after the invention of penicillin. It's also been a place which has had very important convenings about major diseases that threaten to be either pandemics or major scourges for large sections of our population. There was a major conference, and the first major conference on HIV in the 1980s, and subsequently major gatherings around SARS, and most recently around COVID and the pandemic from which we seem to be finally, if not emerging, at least taking to a non-pandemic level at this particular moment. So it has been a major convening space across its entire history, and it continues to be that, if in a somewhat different way than it was perhaps before. But the New York Academy also, it has a publication series. It has, in fact, the oldest scientific journal in the US, now called the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. We do a great deal of work in the educational space, which is to say we work with young people, principally in middle and upper schools, to provide after school or extracurricular kinds of opportunities to engage, for example, in what we call innovation challenges, which are ways to get young people excited about a scientific project, but a project in the real world, and a project that allows them to see the connections between science and puzzles that they might have, which include how to deal with questions around recycling, or how to deal with questions around, in the case of the pandemic, understanding the nature of a virus that was novel and, for the most part, in early days, completely misunderstood. We use these innovation challenges to not only teach students about science, but also about what the process of doing research is, how they work together. And we always assign them mentors. And we have a large network of scientists, from advanced graduate students to retired scientists, in fact, who volunteer their time to be mentors for young people. And they often find that to be an incredibly gratifying experience, because they see young people get excited. And that often will lead them to go on to do work in STEM fields that otherwise they might have abandoned, just given the fact that they might have gotten one bad grade or had one bad experience and decided to do something a little bit less challenging. In addition to our work in education and in scientific convenings and in publications, we also administer a whole variety of awards, including the Blavatnik Awards for early career scientists. These are awards for younger scientists who we hope will go on to get Nobels, but we give them a lot of resources and a lot of recognition in hopes that at that early stage in their career, it will really propel new and bold research and advanced science in a way that some of the more senior awards don't do in such a direct way, since they're often given to scientists after they've made their big discoveries and done their major work. In 2019, 2020, when I came to the Academy, first to talk to them and then to take up the position, these were the principal things that the Academy did. Of course, I joined 2 months after the pandemic began. All of our convenings had to go online. We could no longer bring people together, as indeed no one was able to do at the time. But I also became interested in thinking about ways to expand the mission of the New York Academy. And just one example, the first of the new programs we've undertaken is building something that came directly out of the experience of the pandemic, namely, how perhaps might we be better prepared for the next, if not pandemic, certainly the next major world crisis, and how, indeed, given the provenance and mission of the New York Academy of Sciences, might we think about this in relationship to questions around scientists themselves and scientific resources that would be inevitably so important in dealing with any kind of major crisis, whether it was climate related, whether it was another kind of pandemic, or God forbid, some other set of potentially existential threats that we know lurk around us. And so we built something called the International Science Reserve, and used our existing networks as also to build, and we use this as an opportunity also to build new networks, to try to connect people, to think about who might be readily available and how might we get them better prepared to both raise their hands, but also connect with each other in the event of something like this pandemic happening again soon. So we built that, and we've done another number of other new things as well, which perhaps I'll wait to talk about when we talk about some of the thematic questions that are confronting scientists and scientific policymakers in a short while.
By way of metaphor, it seems to my mind like Doctors Without Borders, but for science. I hope that's not too much of an overreach or a different way of describing it.
Well, it's interesting that the New York Academy of Sciences actually has a patent on the phrase scientists without borders. So we use that to, in fact, describe what this reserve is intended to do. And by Scientists Without Borders, we mean not just national borders, but we also mean disciplinary borders and indeed even institutional borders, because there are scientists, of course, not just in universities or in companies that are known for their work in developing and producing scientific products, but in all kinds of settings in government as well as industry and indeed in many different sectors. And we're trying to bring as many of them together as possible, indeed, across all the borders that exist. So your phrase is one that we use all the time, and as I say, we even have the trademark for it.
We'll come on to some of kind of the contemporary issues in science and communication and public policy in a second. But just to spend one more moment in reflection, to look back on all of your experiences, travels, publications, and positions held, do you think that there has been any one thread that has either guided you through, that has led you from one position to the next publication to the next post? Or is there something that you maybe look back on and realize that from the beginning, this has always been behind what you've been up to?
There's one thing that has certainly been a constant in everything I've done, and that is that I never fit firmly within one particular disciplinary lane. I did my original studies in history, but I did my work in history on South Asia, and as a consequence of that, did my research and my training both in college and in graduate school in a program that basically was an area studies program, as we call it in the U.S. Academy. And area studies is inherently a multidisciplinary operation. It brings together humanists and social scientists, and indeed people from just about every different department and program, as long as they have an interest in a particular place. Area studies grew up in the U.S. after World War II, and of course had a strategic component to it. But it also actually, by dint of bringing together people from different disciplines, had a major effect on university organization, university life in the post-war years, and I was certainly influenced by that. So I was never quite sure what my real discipline was, and in fact, the first thing I did of an institutional kind was at the University of Michigan, where I built with one other colleague a joint PhD program in anthropology and history to give students the kind of educational opportunity I'd had sort of by dint just of accident when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. So I've always had this sense that we get interested in joining the academic world because we have broad interests that sometimes take an expression around a particular area or topic or theme or question. But we don't begin as political scientists or sociologists or literary scholars. And of course, there's a big role for specialization in science as well as in non-scientific fields. And we know that that has all kinds of advantages. But we also know, as a colleague of mine at Columbia used to say, that sometimes academics can be charged over the course of their lives with knowing more and more about less and less. And I always, sort of bridled a bit against the kind of disciplinary restrictions that I felt, were very much a part of the way in which we appoint colleagues, evaluate them for promotion, recognize them for distinction, and so on, thinking perhaps that we needed to maintain a little bit more of the openness and intellectual breadth that brought us into this world in the first place as academics. So that's a kind of narrow academic perspective, but it does reflect itself in the work I've done. And even now at the New York Academy, many years later, I'm certainly working to bring scientists and non-scientists together to work on projects of virtually everything in virtually everything that we do. So that's something that certainly has kind of been a theme all the way through my life and career. I've also, however, tried to balance something else, which is on the one hand, the tendency to be sort of very kind of lonely scholar to do my writing, to do my research, to spend time in my study alone, but also my interest in bringing that knowledge into greater contact, not just with other disciplines, but with the world outside the study, whether that study is in a university or wherever it might be. And I've felt that there's a huge need to attempt to break down some of the barriers certainly between universities and the world outside. And I think it's had very damaging impact on certainly on American life, where there's on the one hand a kind of pervasive anti-intellectualism, a term that has been used by a lot of different people, but a book about which was written by Richard Hofstadter, who is a historian at Columbia before my time, but a very, very important historian and a very, very important book about the role of anti-intellectualism in American life, and we see the relevance of that again today in a way that I think is very damaging, not just for science, but indeed for public discourse and our broad public political life. And I recognize that I've always been interested in trying to find ways for us to think about how to make better connections between the role of the intellectual and the public sphere that is so important, in fact, for our social, political, economic lives. And in that respect, I found myself constantly getting involved in public activities that take me out of the study, and certainly coming to work at the New York Academy of Sciences is another expression of that interest. Anyway, probably a longer answer than you intended, but that's how I see some common threads across my career.
Mhm. And on that note of anti-intellectualism, there's a phrase that came into public parlance some 7 years ago now in England. The public had had enough of experts. That has had echoes in politics for, the near decade since, and it's kind of resounded across a lot of fields of application in policy for the UK, and it's mirrored by some kind of tides of political turns across the globe, really. To highlight one of the main challenges of the 20th century of science communication was that the scientist was correct. They had the information, and other people had to then receive that information. Would you say that, from what you've seen over the last 20, 30 years, that the 21st century of science communication has addressed any of those shortcomings, or if we're doing any better with where we are now in terms of communicating not just policy and science, but effective, useful information, and just not kind of being the ivory tower, unassailable and unimpeachable?
Well, you packed a lot of questions into that
I
single
can make
point.
that short if it's any easier of
No,
how has the last 20 years been, but
yeah.
I'm a
No,
little.
no, no. It's interesting. I think you've actually made that question into a richer one, and I'll try to at least address the key parts of it. And of course, in the first instance, I have to say that maybe we've learned some things, but it hasn't necessarily reflected itself in a better situation in terms of where we are with science communication or with issues around expertise. I think there are lots of people in the world of communications who have been enjoining us to think better about the ways we talk about sophisticated, arcane, specialized forms of knowledge, that we need to tell stories and not just use statistics and facts if we're going to reach a broader audience, and so on and so forth. So there's a recognition that one has to talk to the public in a different way than one talks to one's graduate seminar. And people, I think, have bought into that. But has it really helped us? Has it really worked? One of the major tensions, I think, over the course of the last 20, 30 years has been around, in the field of science anyway, has been around this sense that is a pervasive and really persistent one, that scientific knowledge has a kind of status that demands that we acknowledge that it's more, in some sense, closer to the truth than anything else, that it really is predicated on facts, that it's not contaminated by issues of human judgment and bias and the like. And so that has led, I think, many people, and it certainly happened in the early days of the pandemic, to simply say what we need to do is follow the science. In fact, that was a phrase that was certainly used in the U.S. And it was used in my academy as well in some of its press releases that were coming out just as I joined. And when you press a scientist and and you ask them what is the science, they then will say, well, the science is really about a process, and it's about a process of discovery and debate and experimentation and verification. And so, of course, the science is actually a term that refers more to a method and a process than it does to a single set of truths or facts or outcomes. But they wouldn't say that. And we all saw the trouble that we got into during the vaccine, during the pandemic, around questions of public health. Should we or shouldn't we wear masks? Should we be 6 feet socially distant, or 8 feet, or 4 feet? And of course, what are the issues in taking a vaccine that hasn't been widely tested, that never been used before, and so on and so forth? We saw in real time the way science works. And it was, I think, a real challenge, both for the scientific community and indeed for the world of people who are primarily engaged in communication, whether they're public health experts or journalists or political figures or what have you. In all of that, of course, I think we made a lot of mistakes. And we thought that if you bring the public too much into the uncertainties that are part of the scientific process and method, then you don't have an authoritative position from which then to say you really have to wear a mask, or you have to take this vaccine, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. And yet it backfired. And I think it backfired in a very big way. And there's a lot of as we say in the U.S., Monday morning quarterbacking going on right now with respect to that. A piece in the New York Times just a few days ago, for example, that really went through questions around what we learned from the pandemic for the next pandemic. And it began with communication, with a line somewhere, somewhat to the effect of communication isn't just a part of the response to something like a pandemic, it is the response. And we failed. We failed at that. Now, it also taps more generally, though, into what you began your question with, namely, what is the status of the expert? And why is it that, whether in the UK or the US, or for that matter, in many other parts of the world, experts have they've lost their patina. In many cases, of course, they become not just objects of ridicule. We've always heard, at least here, about eggheads and other terms used to disparage the expert, but often they're seen as the enemy, as people, in fact, who use expertise to cloak behind that a whole set of interests and intentions that, of course, have been seen with perhaps greater skepticism in the last even 10 years, both in the US and the UK, than in many previous decades, perhaps going all the way back to the early 20th century, when there were major debates around everything from Darwin and creationism to just about everything else in the world of scientific expertise. And this is a problem affecting not just science, but it's affecting our politics. Now, some of it, I would argue, is beyond our control, but some of it is our fault. And again, to the point I just made, I really do think that we have to be much clearer about the actual character of the development of scientific knowledge. We have to treat the public as genuine interlocutors in the work that we do. And if we bring them in more, it may not always work, but it will do better than we did, using other methods, to let people know that things do change. I'm going to tell you this today about masks, but I might tell you something else in a week if we do these experiments and we find out, the following. So there's that, and I think that's been an issue. But beyond that, I also think we've seen the use of experts and the use of expertise in areas that have definitely undermined public trust. In almost every trial, in many judicial proceedings, more generally, in government hearings and the like, we bring out experts, and we know that experts are often paid by one side or the other. We saw experts in the tobacco wars, and we hear experts now in the climate wars. And we know you can basically find an expert to hold any position that you want if you pay them enough. And we also know that when experts invoke science, they often, in the context of these kinds of public hearings or statements are actually talking about policy, not about science. And in as much as that borderline between what is actually the science that one is referring to and what are then the implications that might flow from a certain set of findings for some kind of policy outcome, we're going to get in trouble because experts are going to effectively undermine all expertise by virtue of claiming too much, both for themselves and for what they're advocating in that particular kind of exchange. So, there are a variety of, I think, things that we've learned over the last decades about what we've done to make it easier for the public to distrust what we say, what we do, who we are. But I think we need to try to take these instances and figure out better ways of proceeding in the future.
With mass communication, digital communication, always on internet, the opportunity not just for anti-intellectualism to flourish by attacking and denigrating people with expertise when that expertise is put into a political form, but also pseudo-intellectualism or exploitative intellectualism, where there is perhaps debate beyond the point of usefulness around topics that, by and large, people can agree on. With the mission of the New York Academy of Sciences to foster a culture of curiosity, does that then bring up the necessity of not just questioning ongoing science, ongoing interventions, but looking back at past assumed conclusions and being ready to have to defend those against people who are very curious but have taken that curiosity to a new conclusion, shall we say, such as we've seen with some of the flat earth revivalists who have decided, never mind the last 700 years of physics, I've got it right this time.
Yeah, to your last point there, on the one hand, at the Academy, we advocate for much greater participation in the world of scientific, not just exploration, but deliberation about, what these things might mean, what it means to think about the dangers of AI, and maybe we can talk about that in a second as well. But we certainly talk a lot about participation on the one side and democratizing science. And we try to do that both through our work in education as well as our work in some kinds of public engagement. But on the other hand, too much participation can lead precisely to people who feel very sure of themselves. In some instances, you can call it out, as happened with the scientific community in its reactions to Andrew Wakefield's 1998 article and journal article in Lancet, where he made the connection spurious and on the basis of fraudulent research between vaccines and autism. By the way, it took 12 years to get Lancet to retract the piece. It's a very slow process when the scientific community works, but we were able to challenge that. And of course, I think the flat earthers haven't gotten a lot of traction, even though one of them is a very accomplished basketball player, can leap very high. But the kinds of anti-vaccine movements that have built so much political power in different parts of the world that it's hard to talk about total democratization and complete participation in scientific discussion, and yet anticipate how you have to at some point make a scientific point that is about somebody being right and somebody being wrong. So there's that. And perhaps the flat Earth image here has moved me into a different domain, so you can pull me back. But I've been reading a lot of work in the history of science as a part of my new role at the New York Academy of Sciences. It's as somebody who's a social scientist, not a scientist. I went back and I read Thomas Kuhn, his famous book from 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that for the first time really proposed to a very broad public that science doesn't just consist of steady unilinear progress towards ultimate knowledge, but it actually every now and then undergoes a total shift in the way in which we understand the world as scientists. And he called those modes of understanding paradigms, and actually made paradigm into almost a household term. But he also, set a lot of people into panic almost by suggesting that science did fundamentally change over time, and that when you move from one paradigm to another, you really weren't talking about a steady, a steady progression of knowledge and proximity to truth. And Galileo was one of those, and Copernicus were among the most important, scientific thinkers of their time, and changed the way in which we think about the relationship of the Earth and the Sun. And did so, of course, not unconnected to Columbus's journey across the world, and recognitions that the Earth is not just round, but it is also orbiting the sun, not the other way around. And these changed fundamental things, even as Einstein, of course, changed fundamental assumptions that come from Newton. And today we're seeing with quantum mechanics and the way in which ideas like entanglement are being proved by quantum physicists, that there's some really strange things going on in the universe. If you only take a Newtonian view, you can't really encompass all of them in that kind of view of the world, as important as Newtonian physics was and is. So, but the point is that Kuhn was associated then with the rise of what is called, relativism, I suppose, is the term that's used more than any other. And in some views, if you're a relativist, you have absolutely no relationship to the truth whatsoever. It's just everything can go, everything is okay. Now, he had his PhD in physics, and he was astonished when people told him that he was, actually anticipating the student revolutions of the 1960s. He did, after all, write his book in 62 in Berkeley, just before the free speech movement. And I say that because I spent a good deal of time at Berkeley, so I went back to think about the history of his time at the university. But he didn't think that he was destabilizing science. Much more recently, and there's a whole set of things that were unleashed, as it were, by Kuhn's work, in which social scientists talked about the social history of science, how science is done by humans in particular moments of history, in particular kinds of institutions, and the kind of science they do is affected by that. Since Kuhn, since '62 to the present day, I think you can say there's been a kind of acceptance that the history of science is a history of a human activity and not of some kind of transcendent activity. And yet, one of the great sociologists of science who just died recently, Bruno Latour, found himself across his career beginning by talking about how you can do an ethnographic study of a laboratory and talk about the way in which science indeed is a human activity done by not just humans, but humans in labs that have certain kinds of social customs and practices, and almost can be looked at like an anthropological tribe of some sort. And yet, on the other, as he became increasingly alarmed by the nature of climate change, realized the extent to which certain kinds of scientific understandings and certain levels of scientific consensus were actually critical to identify, to alert people to the fact that something's going on here, and we have to do something about it. We can't just sit back and wait for the next paradigm shift. So I'm sorry for that long discursus, but the point is that even as we have accepted a different way of thinking about science, I think all of us who are looking at pandemics, at climate change, future of artificial intelligence, the kinds of enormous power of biomedical technologies, including CRISPR-Cas9 and structural and things in structural biology, are also realizing that there's enormous power to these scientific ideas, and we have to be able to talk about them better. And we also have to be able to think about their implications for our social, political, economic, and social worlds more effectively and more productively.
It does come back to a point that you made earlier of the timeliness of being through the COVID pandemic in a kind of alive lab of communication. And we're reflecting now on those lessons. Chances are there's going to be a next crisis very soon after that, and crisis after crisis. I wonder if there is a matter of timeliness for all of the people outside of the scientific bubble, as it were. Do you think that if someone has been through a pandemic, if someone goes through paradigm shift and has participated in some way, they are likely to be invested or involved in the next paradigm shift that comes along? Or do you think they might be put off the idea because of whatever failures they were in communication? If you lost someone to measles, mumps, or rubella because you didn't get a child vaccinated, and then the vaccine comes along for COVID, how much trust do you have in vaccine development if it's failed you once already? Or if it saved your life, do you trust it more implicitly the next time, even if necessarily the science behind it isn't as robust as it could be?
Well, these are all issues that I think both the Academy at large, but also the International Science Reserve in particular, are really trying to take on. First of all, how do you bring people into a network where they know how to get in touch with each other, where you have some kind of idea of what they could bring to the table in the event of a particular kind of crisis that they, as it were, are pre-networked to work together in the event of a crisis. I mean, these seem to us to be important, if only to save precious time in the event of some kind of emergency. We sometimes call the International Science Reserve because one of our board members is Reid Hoffman, who was the founder of LinkedIn, a kind of LinkedIn for science, and I think that certainly is important. But you've raised some other questions as well that are really very much a part of the thinking that is going on in relationship to the International Science Reserve, namely, how do we think about the lessons of the pandemic and what do we take away from it, and what level of confidence do we require to do something that might be life saving, and what are the trade-offs when you think about possible negative effects, maybe statistically very unlikely but nevertheless real, of taking the AstraZeneca vaccine or what have you. I mean, the we have this kind of laboratory of living life of the pandemic over the last 3 years, where we've collectively experienced, really across the globe, so many issues that are relevant to how we deal in the future with questions on which science certainly has important things to say and to do, but which will require public acceptance, public trust, and public participation to actually translate into something that might, we hope, do something to deal with not just the acute crises, but the chronic crises as well that are part of our contemporary world. So a lot of talk these days about futurism, about existential risk, and yet one of the debates going on even in that space is between how do you think about the long term and how do you think about the short term. We have a lot of short term issues that we need to deal with, and if you only think about the long term, do you just kind of take the immediate issues that confront us as a society, and render them less important? And my view is that this is like everything else in the world. It's a hugely complex set of questions. But for scientists, our point really is to get them poised to work in the world in a way where they can both be, I think, more honest about what it is they do and how they come to know what they know, and perhaps also be more publicly communicative about what they don't know. I mean, one of the things, just as a parenthesis, one of the things you find when you actually talk to scientists, and the same is true of scholars across other disciplines, is that when you actually are talking to them, they're much more likely to tell you what they don't know than what they do know. Former colleague of mine at Columbia, Stuart Firestein, a biologist, wrote a book called Ignorance, and he claims that actually that's how science really proceeds, because it's all about acknowledging what you don't know. And yet, of course, the public wants to hear certain kinds of things that are more settled than less settled, more known than less known. And when you go to a doctor and you have a bad diagnosis and you're told that there's a 65% chance of this and a 45% chance of that, you often have a fundamentally human reaction to it. You want to say, "Doctor, tell me what to do. What would you do?" And maybe that same question needs to go to the scientists. What would you do and why? And what here, where here will you draw your line in the sand? And how do we find the basis for a collective agreement about engaging in some kind of collective action that will, with all the trade-offs and all the complexities and all the unknowns, nevertheless allow science to play a more productive role in society? And these are critical issues. And, again, whether it's with respect to potential climate emergencies that we know are coming, or whether it's, what we're all talking about today, ChatGPT, artificial intelligence going towards artificial general intelligence, the letter that was written on behalf of the Future of Life Institute calling for a 6-month pause in the developments of advanced artificial intelligence because of its threat to humanity. The real point there is to bring the scientific community and the public together to assess some of these risks and to plan for some of the things that we might do, and certainly to do a better job than we did in the early days of the pandemic.
Well, to adjust some of our framing from the political and communication to the personal and cultural perspectives. And I'm careful to say that we're adjusting framing and not changing topic, because those two angles are so closely entwined and hard to pick apart, that if we were to look at the role of institutes as a whole and academics as individuals, to be a person of science in the public sphere and to have public involvement in your profession, how can we best protect individuals and institutes from either misrepresentation or miscommunication, while still keeping the appropriate avenues open for having public involvement into that professional space?
These are really difficult questions, and they become, of
I've got
course,
easier ones if they helped.
yeah, but they become even more difficult because of the role of social media and the fact that everyone now, whether they're tweeting or sending out an Instagram or what have you, can enter into the public sphere in some kind of way that whether they're an influencer or not, they clearly can take their scientific credential, identity, and activities and move them into the public sphere in ways that might perhaps be seen as totally unregulated. And we don't want to countenance forms of censorship and total control over what anybody says. But we also know that there's massively important consequences that attend to something that, again, as I was saying about experts, that anything that is said by an expert on any particular issue, and so there are times when the scientific community has to band together, investigate, and then denounce the work of an Andrew Wakefield, or call out RFK Jr., the anti-vaxxer, who used to be an environmental lawyer doing a lot of work on clean water and now is running for president in the U.S. on an anti-vax campaign that, again, is deeply troubling. You have to call that to account. So there is a way in which we are still working out that relationship between engagement in the public sphere and the individual kind of opportunities that exist for that, and the need for institutions periodically to check that. I think institutions get in trouble when they assume too much control over, the way we talk about these issues, but they can't abandon or abdicate their role entirely. And I think the kind of certification that comes from places like the New York Academy periodically is necessary to say, no, this is not something that has any kind of scientific consensus attached to it. By the same token, this is something to which or this is something about which there is significant scientific consensus, namely that in the case of climate, that things are happening that are going to affect us in a short period of time. So how one balances all of these different kinds of questions around expression, free speech, expertise, the authoritative nature of scientific or academic knowledge. These are all issues that are being renegotiated in the context of a very different kind of public sphere, but ones which are absolutely necessary to take on directly. And institutions, old established institutions like my own, have particular responsibility, I think, to take these on too.
How can scientific institutions and teams and individuals kind of embrace the positives of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then use that to encourage local communities to be more involved as well and to reflect and to elevate otherwise excluded identities, because, it doesn't factor into originally the setup of an experiment, but that the people behind whatever is happening on an institutional or academic level, there are elements of personhood that come into the science, even if they aren't accounted for in the original experimental design.
So I was thinking earlier about questions of representation and diversity when I was making a comment about AI. And there have been people recently who've come out and said, AI is so complex that really it's the people in the tech industries themselves who have to decide what needs to be regulated, what forms of governance might apply, and so on and so forth, because others won't know. And I think we see a particular kind of identity profile, as it were, to many of the people who work in tech, both with respect to gender, race, class, position, and with respect to industry involvement and perspective. That doesn't give me a lot of confidence that that statement is true. And Ezra Klein, in a recent podcast, suggested that the major alignment problem in AI right now is not between just algorithms and certain kinds of human values, but between the fact that the concerns about what AI is going to do and the profit motives and industrial logics of profit making will compel these tech companies to do that really is the alignment issue. We know that in scientific settings that the more diversity you can bring to the table, that is to say, of the scientists who are doing the work, the better, because in fact, and this of course was one of the great conceits also of old science, that it was just the great scientist who would see the truth. But the fact is, people see things differently, and people with different backgrounds and different identity formations and the like will see things differently. They will ask different questions, and they will often see things that are missing. And sometimes those are very practical about how you do drug trials for vaccines, and sometimes those are about even how you engage in thought experiments about fundamental cosmological principles and truths. And I think we all are recognizing that the language of diversity is important for itself, but it's also important for science because it really does make for better science. And it is certainly also the case that when you take the term "scientists without borders," you look at science from the point of view of different parts of the world, as well as different social and cultural positions within any given society, and you recognize that the world is looked at differently, and questions are asked differently, and science is conducted differently, and fundamental issues in science will become actually better as a result of it. So it's not just a slogan that is part of an expression of concern that diversity is long overdue historically because it's the right thing to do. It's also because it's going to create better science. It's certainly the case with social science. It's certainly the case with humanities. Fundamental questions changed in humanistic study because of social movements that brought new people into the academic world that hadn't been there before and weren't given a voice. So these are fundamental to changing the kind of epistemological basis on which we deal with the world. And now, today, as we see almost every issue that we've been talking about that connects science to the world, whether it's with respect to viruses and what do you do when they're novel viruses that take over the world, or whether you're talking about climate, or whether you're talking about structural biology and CRISPR-Cas9, or whether you're talking about AI or what have you, these are all areas in which the fundamental questions about the science involved are also questions that relate to our societies, to our politics, and to all kinds of things that aren't necessarily on the lab bench where the experiments are directly taking place in the first instance. So that makes diversity of participation and diversity of perspective even more important.
Any advice from a practical standpoint that you've gained through all of your experience in administration and in academics for how people can do the right thing by their team members? Success stories for times that there have been individual team members whose well-being can be catered for, can be improved, can be looked after in the face of adversity.
Yeah, it's sometimes easier to look at failures than successes, but the world that we're dealing with now has definitely changed, and not all for the worse by any means. A senior Indian historian passed away just last week. Somebody who had played a major role in the development of a new field in my area of South Asian history called subaltern studies. He created the whole field, in fact. And anyway, he died at the age of 99 just recently. But I was looking in an archive of materials about him and saw him in a workshop in the 1970s in some undisclosed location in a British university, either in Oxford or Cambridge. And it was amazing to see. There were 8 men in their 50s, all white men, except for this one historian who's from South Asia. They were all smoking cigarettes and cigars. They were drinking sherry and talking about the importance of understanding the people in relationship to public ritual and populist politics. It was a kind of extraordinary thing to watch for all kinds of reasons, but not least to realize that such an event would not happen in any of the respects in which I just narrated, right? And not only are we a little bit healthier as a result of not smoking as much, but that discussion about the people, but on with a very exclusive, gendered and et cetera, kind of identitarian perspective would have been very different, and indeed today is very different as a result of much greater diversity. I think with respect to at the New York Academy and the work that we do at the New York Academy of Sciences, I think our greatest impact is at the level of the kind of educational work we do and the fact that we can reach young people, not just young women, but young people from backgrounds that would never have given them the opportunity to develop their interest and skills in science, to do so and to see for themselves, in part because of the increasing diversity of the mentors that work with them, a future in in a world of science that they never would have imagined possible in earlier generations. And that work we do is meaningful, and it will frequently bring people from backgrounds that really would not have allowed them those opportunities to have a different kind of life, and then to make science such a more vital enterprise than it's been, and they'll find some of the solutions to the problems that I've been talking with you about today. But I also think that the other kind of success story really comes from giving teachers new kinds of tools, providing new ways of thinking about both how one builds a community of knowledge and then sustains it, through the variety of things that we make available, whether specifically in education or whether in conferences or publications or other kinds of public engagements. These are things that do have an impact, and we see it. In the early career scientific awards that we've been doing and giving now for more than a decade. Just recently, I was in the UK for these award ceremonies, and the three finalists, the three laureates, were all women scientists in biology, chemistry, and physics. It's not that we've created that difference. It's obviously a lot of different people working in a lot of different ways. But I see a much more vital community, and I see a much more vital attitude on the part of this community to taking on collective projects around the engagement of science with society that gives me confidence and hope for the future.
To come back to something that you've touched on, with the core mission of the International Science Reserve being to get ahead of the science, you've mentioned AI and ChatGPT, gene editing, structural biology. Do you think there is any point in calling out where the next crisis might be, or is it a matter of kind of interdisciplinary readiness that no matter what might come up, we've got someone in the area ready to consult, console, and be ready to respond to? Or is there still an application for having an incredibly specific tool versus a Swiss Army knife, intellectually speaking?
Part of the rationale, as you just said, for the International Science Reserve is clearly to create this kind of network I've spoken of and to prime it, as it were, so that it's ready to get into action as needed and without a great deal of delay. But that's only part of, I think, either what the International Science Reserve is, or certainly of what is required to make a real difference. The great writer Michael Lewis in the U.S. wrote a book about the pandemic in which he talked about one of the unsung heroes of the pandemic in the U.S., a local public health officer who had frequently gotten herself crosswise with local political and other public figures in California where she worked, who became really a major figure in working through ways to respond in early days to the pandemic. And it's a book called Premonition. I highly recommend it. But I also take from it the lesson that partly it's not just about tapping into the folks who are in the major labs and the major scientific institutions, but allowing other people who might get passed over or ignored potential voice and access, so that they can bring oftentimes what they know that is really critical to the table. And then beyond that, I think there is there's the challenge of not just of not just connecting people and priming the pump, but using the exercises that we engage in to look at what a crisis around, say, wildfire or flooding or another kind of pathogen might bring, but to really begin to think through not just mistakes that were made, but the issues that the kind of less obvious issues that emerge in any given crisis. We all know you have to put a fire out, but uh, we know also that fires produce massive air pollution that affects people way downwind of where the actual fire is. We know that every kind of crisis has its immediate effects and then all kinds of much more indirect effects. And we also know that there's a kind of a social structure to a crisis, so that whether it's a pandemic or whether it's climate change, it's going to affect some people, some communities, some parts of the world more than others. That those with fewer resources, and if I can use the term in this context, fewer reserves of capital of one kind or another, as well as literal, are going to be much more negatively affected by these kinds of crises. And this is not just a social justice. This is actually about recalibrating how we think about the impact of a crisis and the obligations of scientists with respect to those crises. And scientists are not there simply to create the vaccines, but they're also there to create the infrastructure of response more broadly that will require, everything from making sure that when you're doing the trials, you're actually doing the trials on the people who are going to be perhaps most resistant to taking the drug or the vaccine. That when you're thinking about a climate related disaster, you're actually thinking about the problem of what happens to people who don't have the resources to just pick up and move in the event of a fire or a flood. And of course, very quickly, the scientific questions and the more broad social questions begin to blend into each other. And I say, as an Academy of Sciences, we have to embrace that. And that is indeed part of our challenge and part of our mission.
Well, if people want to know more about the Academy of Sciences and more about the International Science Reserve, where can they head online to find out more about the mission and more about maybe some of those exercises and the ongoing readiness that you are going through?
So we, as usual, have a lot on a website. Easiest thing is just to check the nyas.org website, which is the New York Academy of Sciences website. But there's also a link in there to the ISR at nyas.org. And I don't want to get it wrong here, so I'll just invite people to look at the New York Academy of Sciences website to get the links. But we would love to hear from you. We sign up anyone who is interested to be part of our network. And it really is about a kind of global international network of citizen scientists, and not just about so-called experts that we're reaching out to. And of course, we're also very anxious to recruit new people to attend, whether online or in person, our convenings, our conferences, our activities of different kinds. So please do check out our website.
Is there any way to simply or neatly encapsulate ways to bridge divisions, heal the rifts between the institutes of science and the institutes of society, as a way to bring these two together, or just recognize that they are already entwined? Any way that those might kind of flourish in the near future?
So in 1959, C.P. Snow gave the Reith Lecture and identified what he called the two cultures as a major problem with respect to British universities at the time. And of course, he meant by the two cultures the sciences and the arts. And he called for what he called greater bilingualism between these two very different cultures and, by implication, very different languages. Although he called for a collapse of these two cultures, we can see more than 60 years later that the two cultures are alive and well. And it's very hard to bridge them in a meaningful way, and certainly in a way that would create the kind of bilingualism that he spoke of. But I think we've seen of late the absolutely critical nature of that call, since it's only with that kind of bilingualism that science is actually going to be able to confront the current and future challenges that we all accept are part of our world and likely part of our future. So the work we're doing at the Academy is meant to try to address that. Obviously, I'm a social scientist, as you said, and view science from a perspective that attempts that kind of bilingualism. But I actually do believe that we need a more social kind of science going forward, and that science will be more effective and it will be better qua science as well, in as much as it does, in fact, take on board not only many of the questions that come out of humanities and social sciences, but the kinds of people who come out of those fields and people who come out of those fields both within the university and outside the university. So I'm looking to build the ISR as Scientists Without Borders, but I'm actually looking as well to build the Academy as a place in which even the definition of the scientist doesn't have a border either. And we can try to build a new kind of collaboration and indeed a new kind of bilingual set of understandings that will enable science to deal with the incredible challenges we face in the 21st century.